Let's go to Brisbane now and catch up with LNP Senator for Queensland, James McGrath. Thanks for talking to us, James. First up, I've got to get your sense of the inflation numbers and just how difficult an interest rate rise, the first one for a decade, will be if it comes next week in the middle of a campaign.
Well, the people I speak to know that Australia has been hit by two issues out of our control. First of all is the war in Ukraine, and secondly, the COVID pandemic. So the business people I speak to understand that's causing issues for their supply chains, and that's going to has a flow-on effect in terms of prices. So no one that I speak to is blaming the government for this. They're appreciative of the work the government has done through the last budget to try and support people. So we've got to put that where it is. In terms of interest rates, look, that's a decision for the Reserve Bank. It's independent of political parties. I'm many things, but I'm certainly not an economics commentator, and I'll leave that up to those with lots of letters behind their name to talk about what the Reserve Bank may or may not do.
Well, if the rate increase comes, and it has to come, we've got emergency low interest rates at the moment. The downside for Anthony Albanese is he'll have to learn another number after finally learning what the cash rate was. The unemployment figures didn't change, so he didn't have to relearn a number there. He's been in COVID isolation the last 5 days. He's told us, and in a couple of interviews we've seen, that he's not very crook. Do you think Labor are taking the opportunity to hide him here? Because he could obviously be doing endless radio, television interviews out of isolation. So many politicians around the world have done so.
Totally, and obviously we wish him well. Anyone who's got COVID, we hope they get better. But if I was stuck at home for 7 days, you wouldn't get me off, and I was running to be Prime Minister of this country, you wouldn't get me off the radio. You can have a live view unit, you can do TV interviews from home. So I don't think he's in sort of some form of witness protection. He's in witless protection because Labor people realise that he's not up to the job of being Prime Minister, and the less the voters see of him, the better it is for Labor. Having said that, when you look at some of those characters who have been filling in for him, you've got to be a little bit scared about should Labor win the election, the people are going to be running this country.
Now, we're getting to that stage of the election campaign where former campaign strategists like yourself, people who do the job you used to do, are haggling over preferences. And this could be quite consequential for the coalition, because there's been a blow-up out of Tasmania, because the Liberals are planning to preference Jackie Lambie ahead of One Nation. Pauline Hanson is now threatening to preference Labor ahead of the coalition in some crucial seats around the country. How much of a problem could this be? It'd be very, very dramatic, really, in key marginal seats, wouldn't it?
What I would say to anyone who is not going to give their number one vote to the Liberal National Party, please do, we want your number one vote, is you've got a choice between who do you want to be Prime Minister? Do you want it to be Scott Morrison and his team, or do you want it to be Anthony Albanese and his mob? And every time a vote goes to Labor, that is Anthony Albanese getting that one step closer to becoming Prime Minister, and Adam Bandt sitting around that cabinet table. So I would implore those fellow Conservatives out there to not preference Labor, but to preference the Liberal National Party, because otherwise you're going to have Adam Bandt, Christina Keneally, all the other mean girls all sitting around the cabinet table, and that would not be good for Australia.
Yeah, well, it's always an important reminder that the voters control their preferences. You can always preference the way you want, and you decide so. And obviously, as you've just said there, we're going to hear the coalition right around the country focusing squarely on people and their preferences. If you want to give us a whack by voting for someone else, you're going to say, please put us number 2. That's going to be crucial. I want to come to this climate change debate because it really has led to some misleading media, but also some difficult conversations within the coalition. It's been kicked off by the reaction to some of what Matt Canavan's been saying on this program and others about net zero by 2050. Here's Matt Canavan on this program on Friday.
Net zero is kind of dead anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson's already said he's walking away from it. He's pausing it because of the situation in Ukraine. Germany is investing in coal and gas infrastructure. And the Biden administration is running around the world trying to get all sorts of countries like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Iran even to produce more oil for themselves. So what we've got to do in this country clearly is worry about our own energy security, our national security, not hurting our oil refineries like Labor plans to do. because clearly with the situation we face, with the rising aggression of China, the risks in our region, we have to secure Australia first.
Now, there's Matt Canavan. He said similar things elsewhere. He's never supported net zero by 2050. He's always reserved the right to vote against that if he's returned to the Senate. And of course, that's the difference with the coalition parties. People can dissent. But he's not saying there's a change to the policy. He's saying it's not happening. And he's dead right, isn't he? In Europe and the US at the moment, especially because of the energy crisis, they've just forgotten anything about their climate goals. They're focusing on energy security.
Oh, well, Matt's views are well known, and Matt has been consistent in his views. And so I sort of am a little bit surprised by what other sections of the media have been saying about his views because, well, he's been consistent with those views. I'd probably disagree with him to an extent because the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have been very clear in saying that we are taking to this election a net zero by 2050. But the difference between us and Labor is Labor want to bring in taxes to do it. We want to use technology like the announcements that the Prime Minister made yesterday in Townsville with Phil Thompson. So there is a difference there. You've got
well, hang on a second though. The Labor have got a higher target by 2030, which will obviously cost more and cause more disruption over the 8 years. But the point, what Matt Canavan is saying about net zero by 2050 is not really about policy and it's not really about commitments. It's just an observation about the bleeding obvious globally that nobody's thinking about those targets. They're more than they're far less likely to come to fruition than not. I mean, it's just a nonsense to even be talking about them. But there are new coal-fired power stations being built, and then their lives being extended in Germany. The UK looking to get more coal and gas. The US trying to source more petroleum. I mean, the idea that somehow the world's on some net zero mission is nonsense.
Well, I don't think people were really talking about net zero till my good friend and colleague Senator Canavan re-announced his position on that. You know, my position is to make sure, as a Liberal National Party senator for Queensland, is that I work with my fellow colleagues to stand up for those jobs in the resource sector who will be affected by Labor's policies in this issue. And we've seen Labor's confusion last week in relation to what Chris Byron was saying, what the member for Shortland was saying, and Richard Marles, who really no one knew what he was saying. And this is what we've got to focus on. Who is going to be sitting around that cabinet table? Is it going to be Anthony Albanese and these ministers who don't know what they're talking about? Or is it going to be Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce and our plan, a serious, stable, sober plan to make sure that we do reach these targets, because that's a commitment that this party and this government has made.
We will see. Thanks for joining us, James. Always good to talk to you.
Anytime, Chris. Toodaloo.